Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and our Kennan Institute, and our partners for today's event at the U.S. Water Partnership, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's discussion. For those of you joining a Wilson Center event for the first time, I'll say a quick word about us. The Wilson Center is a think tank based in D.C. It is the living memorial to President Wilson, mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. Programs at the Wilson Center are regionally and topically focused. We cover every corner of the planet and today's most pressing issues. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, is focused on connecting the intersection of environment, health, and security to foreign policy and international development. For nearly 30 years, ECSP has worked with an incredible network of scholars, practitioners, and policymakers to bring traditional notions of security up to date, including the role that environment and natural resources play in conflict, political instability, and in building peace. Water is a big piece of this evolving equation. Not only are our food and energy systems tied to water, but so are trade and transport, human and ecosystem health. Water flows through the relationship between a government and its people. When the state fails to provide clean and safe water to shore up resilience to droughts and floods, trust in the state is eroded. And where trust between citizens and their government is eroded, instability grows. We launched the Water at Wilson series in December to recognize and elevate the centrality of water in issues of foreign policy, international development, and security. Our panel today will address a sobering reality when it comes to water, the growing incidence of its weaponization in conflict, with Russia's war in Ukraine as a glaring example. Russia's incursion into the country has dealt both direct and indirect blows to Ukraine's water infrastructure and supply. Two of the men working to maintain Lviv's water utility are with us today to share the reality of what this looks like in their city. Before we get to our panel, I'm very pleased to introduce Christopher Rich, the Executive Director of the U.S. Water Partnership, for some brief introductory remarks. Chris and his colleague Nomi Seltzer were instrumental in tapping their networks to help bring today's panel to fruition. Prior to his position at the U.S. Water Partnership, Chris had a 30-year career as a Foreign Service Officer at the State Department. Today, he's bringing all of those skills developed over that long career to his position at the U.S. Water Partnership, where he leads efforts to facilitate multi-sector cooperation around water resources and infrastructure by connecting U.S.-based experts to the international community. Water needs champions, and the U.S. Water Partnership plays an important role in lifting those champions up. Chris, thank you for your partnership with today's event, and over to you.
Lauren, thank you so much. Great to be with you this morning. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Rich at the U.S. Water Partnership. I want to thank the Wilson Center for hosting us today. Also, thanks to the Kennan Institute for co-sponsoring this session with us. Just a very quick word about the U.S. Water Partnership as we get started. We are an independent nonprofit based in Arlington, Virginia. For the last 10 years, we've been dedicated to the prospect of uniting and mobilizing some of the best of American hydrology, engineering, and ingenuity to address water challenges around the world. Since 2019, we've been running a multi-million-dollar water utility partnership program with our partners at the Water Environment Federation. It's a program that we designed to boost climate resilience, share technologies, and we've partnered some of the most progressive and innovative water utility operations across the United States with major urban water utilities in 5 countries in Southeast Asia. We're a member of the UN Global Water Operators Partnership Alliance, GWOPA, and it's in fact through GWOPA that we were able to meet and invite Dmytro Venkovich and Volodymyr Belinsky, the brave Ukrainian water operators from Lviv, whom you're going to get to meet and hear from in just a moment. You know, we have read and heard much in our media in recent weeks about deliberate Russian military attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine, including missile bombardment of the electric grid. And we understand all too well what this means for drinking water supplies, wastewater treatment, both of which depend heavily, of course, on electric power to operate pumps. Using water and depriving people of water as a weapon of war, as insidious as it is unfortunately not new. In conflicts, we've seen different ways that water can be used, including attacks on water infrastructure, water workers, denying access to safe water. UNICEF produced an excellent 3-volume report called Water Under Fire. And by the way, and I'm very pleased, Sebastian Truffaut, you could be back with us this morning. Sebastian was the UNICEF WASH director in Ukraine for some years. He's going to share some of his experiences with us this morning. But according to the UNICEF report, we have first, attacking water and sanitation infrastructure, both direct intentional attacks, such as targeting pipelines, pouring concrete into wells, and inadvertent attacks, collateral damage, where reckless bombardment, no attempt to avoid critical civilian infrastructure, results in damaged or destroyed water and water sanitation systems. Stopping the flow of water. This can include turning off pumping stations so pipes run dry, and what we're seeing, the shutting down of electrical systems that water pumping stations need to pump water. Also, the contamination of water. Water sources are actually poisoned. I mean, this is a particularly ugly tactic to deny communities safe drinking water. Attacking water sanitation workers. Humanitarian and local workers around the world are often at risk when working in conflicts. Many have come under attack. Some have been injured, wounded, or killed, repairing critical civilian infrastructure. And even the threat of these attacks can deter maintenance or repair, leaving communities without safe water. And finally, the denial of humanitarian access, and often in conflicts, we see humanitarian workers and supplies that are denied to people who need them. So this is a very sobering, horrific story. It's one that needs to be told and one that we need to hear. And I'm also very happy that we have with us this morning Franklin Broadhurst, who we'll introduce in just a moment, the WASH technical advisor at USAID, who will talk a little bit about the US response. And delighted that we have Erica Weinthal, professor of environmental policy at the Nicholas School at Duke, back with us. She's been doing a lot of writing about this subject. So we have a terrific panel for you this morning. Again, Lauren, thanks so much. I'm going to hand back to you, and thank you for having us this morning.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists before handing it over to Dmytro and Volodymyr for their presentation, and then we'll go to some brief remarks from our expert panelists before opening it up to Q&A. So first we'll hear from Dmytro Vankovich, who's the director of the Lviv City Communal Enterprise Water Utility. He's worked with the company for 12 years and served as the head of the company for 4 years. He specializes in mechanical engineering and finance. With him is Volodymyr Belinsky, who's a deputy chief engineer for the Lviv City Communal Enterprise Utility. Volodymyr oversees international relations and is responsible for project implementation. He's worked with the company for 3 years and specializes in electrical engineering. We had the opportunity to hear from Volodymyr and Dmytro last month, and their presentation was very sobering, but also very comprehensive, and we felt like it just needed to be told on a larger platform. So that's why we pulled this public event together, and we're so glad that you're all able to tune in. After we hear from our Ukrainian colleagues, we'll hear from Sebastian Truffaut, who just from July 2017 to November of last year was UNICEF's water sanitation and hygiene chief in Ukraine. Sebastian's a hydrogeologist and environmental engineer whose career includes experience in the private sector, international NGOs, and the UN. His expertise covers urban WASH, water resources management, environment, and risk management in development settings or complex humanitarian contexts. Franklin Broadhurst is the WASH technical advisor in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. He is a civil engineer and humanitarian advisor whose career includes US military, the Peace Corps, private sector, and international NGO experience. He's worked for 9 years with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, now called the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, as a WASH advisor, primarily covering humanitarian responses in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Erica Weinthal is a professor of environmental policy and public policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, and a founding vice president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and an associate editor at the new journal Environment and Security. Erica specializes in global environmental politics and environmental security with an emphasis on water and energy. Her current project is on the targeting of civilian infrastructure and humanitarian response in the wars in the Middle East and North Africa. We will have time for Q&A in the second half of today's discussion, so please submit your questions via the chat box under the streaming video at any point in the discussion. During the Q&A, I'll also invite Miles Price, the Deputy Team Leader in USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, to join the discussion. Miles is the Deputy Manager for Planning on the Bureau's Ukraine response. He's worked on numerous humanitarian crises over the year, including several years leading programming on Yemen and serving on disaster assistance response teams in Liberia, Nigeria, and Iraq. So he'll be able to bring in an additional dimension to the discussion. But first, let me hand it over to Volodymyr and Dmytro for a presentation from Ukraine.
Thank you. Volodya, please share the presentation. First of all, I want to say that I'm glad to be here with you, and it is a great honor to represent Ukrainian water sector and to make short overview about our situation during the war. We called our presentation Water Under the Gun. The next. And first of all, short information about general condition of water supply in Ukraine, and 80% of drinking water supply comes from surface sources, and only 20% goes from the underground intakes. And mostly the surface sources related with our main river, Dnipro. You can see it's quite at the middle of the country, and other smaller rivers that also related with the Dnipro River. And 99% of urban population had access to centralized water supply system before the war. And after the starting the war, this situation dramatically worsening. Please, next. Even before the war, we had a challenge to renovate and upgrade our water supply system. And you can see the figures. The network losses amounted to 36% out of total volume of produced drinking water. And 35% of the infrastructure is in state of emergency. After the war, please next. We had attacked our system, and we tried to describe it on the map. We divided on the three main zones, the whole territory of the country. The worst situation is on the red zone on the right. This is especially war zone, where there is no centralized water supply because of war activity. The second area is affected by the hostilities, where the infrastructure is currently being rebuilt. It's mostly a central zone of Ukraine. And third one, it's a green one. It's a conditionally saved area on the western part of Ukraine, but still areas that are subject to the rocket attacks on critical infrastructure, and these areas became a place of refuge for millions of refugees. Next, please. We met several challenges during the war, and during this wartime, the critical infrastructure has been precisely targeted by the enemy and deliberate destruction of the main elements of our water infrastructure. The main examples is main water pipelines, and this is on the left. This is a real pipeline that was destroyed in the Mykolaiv region on the south of Ukraine, and approximately 1 million citizens was out of the water. Next, it's a pumping station. It's a real pumping station in the Chernihiv. It's a east-north region of Ukraine. And mostly all the power electrical substations were attacked across all the country. Next, please. Second challenge is due to significant migration. Due to this challenge, Ukraine's water utilities lost their ability to be financed by the consumers. And they lost most productive human resources because of this migration, but not only. In addition, they're losing their productivities because majority of the most productive ages of the men goes to serving in the army, in army. Please next. Another one, it's historically it's occurred that majority of the water companies relied on the Soviet technologies and the equipments, and at the moment there are no possibility to have spare parts and to repair equipment to be efficient. Please next. Destruction of treatment facilities, respectively the inability to treat drinking water because of limited access to the chemicals and reagents that mostly was produced on the companies situated in the east part of Ukraine, mostly occupied or in the war activities, and treat wastewater that enters the dry rivers, which are the sources of drinking water for the neighbor regions. Next, please. And after that, we have environmental damages related with damages in the wastewater treatment plants. And of course, the river became polluted by the untreated sewage water. Please next. What we can do in response of these challenges? First of all, we need to supply the power to our pumping stations, and construction of a backup power supply system is a set of measures. It's not only buying generators, but we need firstly reconstruct all our electrical part of pumping station, and to build and to make stocks of diesel and daily distribution system of this fuel to the generators. They spread it all over the regions as usual. Please next. We need to focus on the use of Western technology and equipment to compensate the impossibility to obtaining components from Russia and Belarus, and to become in additional more efficient. Please next. In general, we feel a great attention to our country and a great will to help us. And probably the biggest challenge us is to build the system of interaction with the donors based on the trust. The war, we understand that it's not only a problem, but the possibility to rebuild and modernize the whole model of the water industry. And our task is to make Ukraine part of the international water partnership. And on this way, we hope for the leadership of the United States, just as the United States is a leader of the military assistance to our country. This is all what we wanted to show in short presentation, and we are open to any question and remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro, and we will definitely come back to you shortly with some questions, and look forward to your expanding on some of those insights in the discussion. But first, let's go over to Sebastian. Sebastian, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, so I'm Sebastian from ESA, and I was there during the war recently until November. Thank you for having me here. Just to give you a bit of a background, I will not have time to go into details on the reasons that led to the configuration of the water systems, but most of it is linked to the development of the mining industrial sectors since the 19th century. But To give you a bit of a background, I would like to come back on the development of the sector at the second time. The infrastructure is old, often largely oversized and inefficient, built after the Second World War as part of an ambitious industrial development plans, and it's the legacy of the Soviet Union. With major constraints related to the lack of water resources, quality or inequality nearby. So therefore, in many cases, water sources is the dispersion point with a single water intake, which make most of water companies vulnerable these days in case of bombardment. These large water systems are 50, 70 years old and are equipped, as Dimitri mentioned, with Russian manufactured equipment, and therefore are highly energy consuming, as the electricity bill represents half to two-thirds of water canals expenses. The water canals are the water companies. And if you have a look at those equipments, these are the pictures from Donbass, for instance, with major pipelines coming from the north in Sloviansk, going through Donetsk Oblast towards the south, going through Olivka, Donetsk, up to Mariupol. So you have the whole area, which represented before the war 3.7 million people, depending on one single network, one single intake. And you can see really the size of the equipment and really old. And I want to highlight here the strong interconnection between electricity, water, and heating. You will understand better the objective of the current strikes these days. Their conception was based on a simple treatment process to reduce suspended solid and organic load, but this limits these days the water treatment. Due to corrosion and outdated treatment, you will find a poor water quality at the top and in water bodies, actually contaminated by the treatment plants, but by industrial chemicals, pesticides, drugs, estrogen.
Sorry to interrupt, Sebastian. Your audio is not super clear, so I wonder if we could.
Better now, or do you want me to disconnect?
Yeah, maybe disconnect and just use the computer mic. We'll give you a second.
Can you hear me now?
That's better. Thank you.
I cannot hear you, but whatever.
Okay.
No, I wanted to say that the water bodies, the surface water is contaminated with industrial chemicals, pesticides, drugs, and other pollutants. And this was only partly treated. And the sector has not benefited from any major investment or reform since the Ukraine's independence in 1991. On the positive side, water supply and wastewater treatment are strict standard. The sector benefits from highly skilled personnel in terms of operation, and with less on water resource management. So this was to just give you a bit of background and to say that the problems of the water utilities did not arise today, but the war worsened them. For the war, what relates to the war in Ukraine, UNICEF has been involved in the water and sanitation sector since the beginning of the forgotten war in 1914, initially focusing on emergency and then gradually integrating recovery and development components. The first activity of support to communities, water tracking, that's what you can see on the screen, led to a questioning of centralized networks. And the survey conducted in 2015, showed the weakness of these networks, the value to have a broader approach, not only community-driven, but also system-oriented. These 8 years in Donbass helped UNICEF, the ICRC, and the WASH cluster to react quickly a year ago. What are the impacts of the war since February? So as Dimitri mentioned, you have massive migration of population towards West with 8 million IDPs and 6 million refugees in other countries, which makes a third of the population of Ukraine moving in May 2022. International aid actors had to relocate as well. The situation was hectic with the total disorganization of the society, and the Voda Canals, the world company, faced many challenges. Increase of consumers in the western side, decrease of revenue on the eastern side with the same quantity of water delivered, attacks on the east and south with extensive damages, specific Russian-made equipment, staff drain, and a poor quality at the end. For UNICEF and ICRC response, because we're on the same kind, the contingency planning that we prepared for the East was useful for the first phase of the response country-wise. The main focus was on supporting people, especially those on the move, IDPs in collective centers, key institutions for children, non-displaced people and returnees with life-saving activities and APC, infection prevention and control. The other main area was on supporting critical services, water systems, hospitals, and civil protection for the provision of adequate safe water and sanitation services to children and families. And for this, we reimbursed or delivered water treatment chemicals, as you can see on the screen, or machinery, water trucks, or water diggers. And of course, installing equipment where and when needed. For the WASH cluster, we go countrywide as well, and install a national WASH cluster and divide it into different zones to better manage, better coordinate the action. The first action we did was to coordinate the communication between water utilities and donors with the Ministry of Regional Development and the National Water Association, Ecologia. These two channel all the demands from the water canals and present them to the donors and the different international organizations. Since then, UNICEF signed an MOU with this National Water Association to create a technical cell that analyzes the needs from the different water canals and prioritize them for the humanitarian committee to support. Most of the work that we do these days is focused on the east and the south on the contact line. And let me just highlight as well the attacks against the WASH facilities. You can see many pictures here coming from Irpin, Chernihiv, Kiev, or some part of or parts from Mykolaiv and the south. Water is strategic. Water was a political element in Donbass the past 8 years, 9 years, and it's definitely weaponized these days. What we did in the past was to, through the WASH cluster, systematically recording the incidents and support the maintenance talks. But this recording of incident allowed UNICEF to publish the Water and the Fire series, which itself helped us to propose the resolution as 2573 to the Security Council on protecting the civilian objects. And Russians and Ukraine were part of the signatories. Since February 22, water and energy are military tools or objectives. We can see it here. Donbass is the region with most damages and needs since February. The Crimean Dam was dynamited on the water intake to the canal on the Dnieper River. This was the main source of water supply for the peninsula and subject of tensions since 2014. Chernihiv, Irpin, Kharkiv in the north and east, so systematic destruction. You can see here what are the extension of the damages. Mykolaiv, with these water intakes in Kherson on the Dnieper, was shared from the beginning as well. You can see here the map of the different damages to the water infrastructure mostly. But these days, since October 2022, we noted less direct targeting to the water infrastructure, but mostly on the energy infrastructure. But I repeat, no electricity means no water. No water, you have no heating. You can imagine when it's -10, -15, -20, like these days in Ukraine. Large-scale bombardments means also a risk on the environment, and especially where you have industries, like in the main cities or in the east. What's next? I mean, on the short to mid-term, the objective is to build back better. That's the approach that we decided to take. It's not about replacing damaged parts with identical ones, but trying to make systems more resilient to disaster, modernizing them. Sorry. This is where UNICEF and the ICRC are best placed to bridge the gap between humanitarian and development needs on the WASH, preparing the ground for large projects and reform, advocate for more investments like we did in North Africa. At the national level, the World Bank, EU, and the Ukrainian government conducted a damage assessment last summer. The water sanitation represented a small part of it, but it was already 8 billion as of June. And this was before the reinforcement of the military actions in the East and before the missile strikes waves since October. The Ministry of Regional Development is currently working on a detailed assessment, but things are constantly evolving. On the humanitarian front, we must continue to advocate for humanitarian access in order to restore access to drinking water, for the militarization of water infrastructure and power plants, and reduce the risk of severe accidents, and for data collection of water pollution and damage on impacted sites. We have no access to the occupied territories, or a few. We have no information on them. So that's where I call for access. On the long term, and that's where you can find the UNDP Resilience Building Framework. The work that UNICEF does with the Water Association and the government and the water companies help prepare the future investments from the bilateral partners and the IFIs. There is a huge need to strengthen the WASH systems and services using the response to emergency for more WASH, climate and disaster resilience, and influence strategic policies in the water sanitation sector. We need a more engagement from the private sector and especially from Western countries, as Metro highlighted a few minutes before. To conclude, the war can be an opportunity to bring attention to the water sector and work on this resilience. But I want to highlight here, before giving the floor to Frank, to pay a tribute to the commitment and dedication of the Ukrainian water workers to keep the water system functioning. And despite that, I presented them as an opportunity for building resilience. It's a disaster for the Ukrainian population and children and families in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. If you could stop the screen share. Oh, you can't hear me. Thank you. If you can stop sharing your screen, and then we can go over to Frank. Frank, thank you for your patience. Frank is the WASH Technical Advisor in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, and is working on the situation in Ukraine. So Frank, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lauren, and good day, everyone. Just as a bit of background, USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, or BHA, our mission is to save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the physical, social, and economic impact of rapid and slow onset humanitarian emergencies. So BHA is also fully committed to implementing USAID's mandate as the lead US federal government coordinator for international disaster response. And in that capacity, BHA leads and coordinates the US government's disaster assistance efforts overseas. So on average, BHA responds to 75 crises in more than 65 countries every year. reaching tens of millions of people around the world with life-saving aid. So to achieve this mission, BHA works through a diverse network of humanitarian partners, both through its funding of and institutional engagement with a wide variety of stakeholders, so UN agencies, other international and local organizations, donor governments, NGOs, local governments, the private sector, and affected communities. And finally, BHA takes a holistic look at humanitarian aid, so providing assistance before, during, and after a crisis, from readiness and response to relief, recovery, and rebuilding. Now, for Ukraine, the United States is gravely concerned about the rise in humanitarian needs following Russia's invasion in late February last year. So almost 1 year since the invasion, more than 17.7 million people in Ukraine require humanitarian assistance. And Ukraine has now surpassed Syria as the world's largest displacement crisis. Currently we have 5.4 million people internally displaced and 8 million refugees. So the escalation in fighting has also exacerbated existing humanitarian needs stemming from years of protracted conflict in eastern Ukraine and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The United States remains committed to supporting people in Ukraine affected by this war. And while USAID has supported UN and non-governmental organization humanitarian programs in Ukraine since 2014, we scaled up our assistance following the February 2022 invasion to match the rapid increase in conflict-related humanitarian needs. So since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February last year, the United States has provided more than 1.9 billion in humanitarian assistance to support people in Ukraine and those who fled to neighboring countries. And this includes more than 1.4 billion in USAID humanitarian assistance. The United States is the largest humanitarian donor in the crisis right now. Now, in terms of WASH, water sanitation and hygiene, the government of Ukraine, USAID, and other humanitarian partners have worked for years to improve access to safe drinking water and to restore critical water and sanitation infrastructure. Russia's full-scale invasion in February of last year exacerbated critical water and sanitation challenges, and it's generated rising concerns of waterborne illnesses, and has also reduced the daily access to water for millions. BHA has provided nearly 104 million to address critical WASH needs in Ukraine since the war began, and which is about 7% of our funding. And WASH outcomes are also supported through other activities such as multi-purpose cash assistance, integrated health, and shelter programming. In terms of priorities for BHA WASH in Ukraine, we're really looking to utilize the existing capacity of local utilities and organizations, targeting the most vulnerable populations and providing life-saving support to as many people in need as possible. And towards that end, response activities have frequently focused on enabling the continuity of operations for WASH services, particularly the water and sewage networks, the Voda canals that Dimitro and Sebastian have been talking about, so that we can provide opportunities for scale in terms of water supply and wastewater. As well, improving WASH conditions at collective shelters and enabling access to hygiene items for those displaced and in transit is a core priority. We've been able to successfully support millions of vulnerable people with these actions, and our partners continue to provide this assistance to this day. One important point, and I think Sebastian alluded to it, is that I just wanted to highlight is that the technical capacity and the dedication of the Voda Canal, these water utility operators and the smaller service providers in Ukraine is indeed an opportunity for the response. I mean, both in terms of providing quality support to war-affected populations right now, but also as liberated parts of Ukraine look towards recovery. But as Dimitro and Vladimir and Sebastian all pointed out, these systems and their operators have been greatly affected by the conflict and warrant our continued support. So just to zoom in a minute on water supply, there are significant challenges to address. Clearly, the war is not over. Displacement and damage continue. The humanitarian response is constantly having to adapt to the evolving context. The outdated nature of many of the systems, plus the degree of damage, often means that prioritizing continued operation is unable to really address the broader need to overhaul these systems. It's also key to highlight that electrical interruptions and surges have a larger impact beyond just the immediate power loss. They also degrade equipment, sometimes to the point of it being inoperable. And damaged equipment or makeshift replacements of available but incorrectly sized equipment further reduce operational efficiencies of these networks. Also having to resort to lower quality water sources, as was the case in Mykolaiv after the main source from the Dnipro River was damaged and inaccessible early in the conflict, not only have public health impacts, but can result in long-term damage to networks. In this case, the corrosive effects of relying on brackish groundwater supplies as an alternative to the fresh water from the Dnipro River. And water supply is essential for centralized hot water heating networks, which provide heat to a large percentage of the country, especially the urban populations. In terms of access and security challenges, in eastern and southern Ukraine, especially, including lack of access to Russian-controlled areas and active hostilities, really limits the international community's humanitarian response. Whereas prior to the February invasion, there was mutual interest, especially for the Vododonbasa system that Sebastian alluded to. There was mutual interest to keep water utilities that span government and non-government controlled areas functioning. That interest has waned significantly. As well, staffing and the ability to operate and maintain these systems is more challenging than ever due to the continuous presence of combatants. And the final point I'll add here is that BHA works with a broad humanitarian architecture, including the UN, other donors, and our implementing partners in finding solutions to these challenges. And working with the USAID Ukraine mission leverages expertise across our energy and wash sectors, as well as humanitarian and development spheres. But all that said, there's a need for broad and sustained support to Ukraine, and neither USAID nor any one donor or actor will be able to address these needs alone. So I'm hopeful that the conversation today will help identify some additional opportunities to address the current humanitarian needs and build towards a stronger future for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. You touched on a number of really important points, and starting with the sort of the cascading impact of back-to-back humanitarian crises and the pressure that puts on our ability to respond effectively. Erica, we're going to come over to you now. And this is a sort of a topic that you've had years of expertise on and have been tracking in other locations, and sort of the international frameworks that exist to sort of address the targeting of civilian infrastructure. Can you help us understand the situation in Ukraine in the context of the broader international discussions?
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Chris, Lauren, for pulling this together again to continue to elevate the situation of what's happening in Ukraine, and offering me a chance also to, to reflect on the situation from the outside, from someone who's not on the ground, but who began their career working in the Soviet Union, studying water resources. But as an academic, I also want to begin by acknowledging my colleagues in Ukraine at the universities who are continuing to teach under fire, continuing to run universities under fire, the students who are taking classes in shelters at times, and those that are working in the, the NGO sector in the universities who are continuing to monitor the status of, the environment. So I am in awe of the work they continue to do. I have been looking at, water as a military tool, as a weapon for quite some time, primarily looking at it in the Middle East. And, we see large patterns taking place or trends that we can track where Chris began today, where militaries, try to control water infrastructure as a way to destroy it or to capture it, as a way to forcibly displace populations. So we're seeing, tracking these huge movements of people from the east to the west as a way to harm livelihoods, to destroy, the economy for civilians, and to occupy territory. Controlling water is a way to occupy territory and to remove civilians. So this is not new. We've heard a lot today about the different ways that water is targeted, through targeting drinking water, targeting wells, treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, canals, pumping stations, irrigation canals. One of the things that we haven't really underscored today is that this has been going on since 2014. UNICEF has been working, in the Donbas region. So this is something, for Ukrainians, water has been under fire for nearly a decade. This is not something that has started this year. And I we need to acknowledge that and recognize that this is just an escalation in attacks from Russia on the Ukrainian population and civilians. What stands out when we look at Ukraine is that this is urban warfare. This is urban infrastructure that is being attacked. These are not the traditional battlefields that we read about in our history books. And it is a pattern of trying to bombard cities into submission through the targeting of infrastructure. Cities were not designed for war. We heard that 99% of urban populations had access to water infrastructure. War is development in reverse. War basically destroys all the gains that have been made when we think about the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and providing access to clean water and proper sanitation. Another thing about thinking about urban wars taking place in urban environments is infrastructure is coupled. So water and energy infrastructure are incredibly linked. So if you take out a power plant, you are essentially taking out water infrastructure. So we need to, these are the reverberating effects that take place that then harm access to clean water in medicals, in hospitals, but also in, educational environments. If students don't have access to water in schools, they can't study. One of the things I want to highlight too is the unimaginable, the unthinkable of what's taking place in Ukraine, besides war taking place in urban environments. In Ukraine, it is unprecedented what we are seeing, that these attacks on nuclear power plants, nuclear facilities. And here too, water is critical for maintaining a nuclear power plant and cooling power plants and the spent fuel rods that exist in power plants. So we need a broader understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about water in the Ukrainian context and the links with energy. It is just not about traditional electrical power plants, but we are talking about nuclear power plants. I've been tracking this with a colleague of mine. We have a paper in process where we've seen at least 34 direct attacks on nuclear power plants since February of last year. And this doesn't include the shelling and the fighting that is taking place in the vicinity of nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants contain dangerous forces, both if they are operational and non-operational, and so they need water. So again, these are some of the nexus issues that need to be recognized. I will talk a little bit about the international context, international humanitarian law, and the protections that exist. International humanitarian law is very clear. Civilian objects need to be protected. You cannot attack water infrastructure. You cannot attack, installations that contain dangerous forces. You need to be able to distinguish military objects from civilian objects. As we have seen in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all of this has been violated. Civilian objects are under attack, under fire. We've also, international humanitarian law calls for the protection of the natural environment too. You can't attack you can't use the environment as a form of reprisals. Those are prohibited. We are seeing, again, wetlands coming under fire, other forms of, ecosystems that need to be protected. One of the interesting things for international humanitarian law that I think needs to be expanded is, what do we mean by in the vicinity of? We often talk about protecting installations, that there shouldn't be fighting near a power plant, but water systems that provide water for the cooling of a nuclear power plant may not be near the power plant. So again, understanding the entirety of the infrastructure in Ukraine. I will conclude by, talking about where do we go from here. As someone who's a political scientist and thinks about politics and political solutions, there are tremendous costs of this war. There are the immediate costs that we are seeing, the humanitarian crisis, we are seeing civilian lives lost, but there are the invisible costs of war that will also have to be taken into account, that come from the breakdown of water systems, from breakdown of medical care, health to the ecosystems, and how do we then think about calculating those costs of war, the mental health costs that come from lack of access to education, healthcare, and things that we may not know for decades to come. Holding Russia accountable is going to be difficult, and this has to be acknowledged. Enforcing international law against a superpower is something that is unlikely because the veto power on the UN Security Council. But this is where I think UNICEF's work with tracking attacks on infrastructure, water infrastructure in the Donbas region was really important because it creates the baseline, the framework for accountability as we move forward. There are other actors who have been doing this. The Conflict and Environment Observatory, the Ministry of Environment. I will note Ukraine has established a special ecological inspectorate to collect evidence. So this is critically important for accountability, for thinking about whether there will be a mechanism for for compensation at the end of war. But also, I would, there are many other mechanisms out there that we can talk about afterwards. The ICRC has guidelines for the protection of the environment in armed conflict. Russia is party to a number of treaties and has violated, their commitments when we talk about protection of Ramsar sites, wetlands. One other thing I will say before I conclude, so we can have some discussion, is that Ukrainian law has actually recognized the crime of ecocide. So there are mechanisms internally within Ukraine too that we should turn to, rather than just looking at what the international community can do, but rather what Ukraine has in place for moving forward, for holding, belligerents accountable for the destruction of the environment, and ways to strengthen both, international law, humanitarian law. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Erica. We have a number of questions that have come in from the audience, but before we get to those, I wanted to give you all an opportunity to comment on or reflect on or expand on any of the remarks from your fellow panelists. Dmytro and Volodymyr, starting with you, if there's anything that you wanted to add or respond to that you've heard come out from the other presentations.
It's have a lot to add, but probably not now. Maybe after answering the questions.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, Sebastian or Frank, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes. Thank you.
Sorry for the previous sound. I just wanted to bounce on Erica's comments on the impact that not having water has on the population. It's important to mention that there is no possibility for students to go to schools, for hospitals to operate, for the economy to prosper, because you cannot produce during these times. So it has a huge impact. I mean, not mentioning the nuclear power plants, if the water stops feeding them. So it could be an ecological disaster, but it's already an economical disaster. It has been already an economic disaster for Ukraine for the past 9 years, since the start of the conflict in 2014. So this has a tremendous impact on children and families over years.
I think that's a really important point, and thinking about the sort of systems that are all integrated and how an impact on one part of the system sort of reverberates, and then thinking about that sort of social and economic and cultural systems, right, that are reliant on water. I'm going to go to the questions because there's a lot coming in, and I want to cover as many as we possibly can. Dmytro and Volodymyr, I think that point that you made about the impact of the conflict on the workforce, right, and on the colleagues that you've had that have gone off to defend Ukraine. A question from Jemima Oki, who's an associate at Azure Strategy on MENA water and food security. She asks, how have you adapted to engineers being diverted to the war effort? Prior to the conflict, what was the turnover of water engineers in Ukraine's water networks, and approximately how many years experience did they have? And adding to that, so thinking about how you're adapting today, but also the future of the workforce, right? And developing sort of tomorrow's professionals in that space. How are you grappling with that? If you are, given all the other challenges? Thank you.
Probably it is one of the biggest challenges in our company, in the industry, probably. If we looking at the Ukraine in the eastern part, of course, it's probably the worst situation. A lot of people going out of these regions, engineers, not only engineers. In the western part, we have a better situation because migration goes towards the western, and we can, in Lviv, we are on the path on the west, and we can adapting some engineers staff from the eastern part of Ukraine, and we do it. But from those cities that is very close to the area that affected of the war, it's there are no big motivation to go to those companies. Only the old staff that used to work in his city and defend the city and to help to survive his city, they're working in it. And only some activists and some other engineers, even from outside, could go over such небезпечні, dangerous area. And in the future, in general, we have to strong the whole our industry, and after that only we can develop the program of adopting, of creating the possibility to invite new engineers and to grow in our industry. But before the ending the war, it is a question of surviving.
Yes. Thank you, Dimitro. This is an interesting question. I don't know if any of you will be able to comment on this, but it's from Michael Keyes, a senior diplomatic fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. With the possibility that this war continues for several years, are experts thinking about linking Ukraine's water supply to its Western neighbors, like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania?
If I may, I mean, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, so it would be very difficult to connect all the country to a single or common water network. It's already difficult for the energy infrastructure to have it, but it's easier, I would say. If you take the example of Donbas region, these days, the Russian Federation tries to install the pipeline 400 millimeters from the Don River to Donetsk Oblast. But this gives only 5% maximum of what is needed in terms of water in the region. So it would require not huge, but incredible investments in terms of pipelines, rendering again the sector quite vulnerable in case of attack. So I would prefer to have local water resources with several water intakes, rather than having a single water network that is interconnected to the whole country. So I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine having a single network connected to the other neighboring countries. It could work for the neighboring regions in the West, but not for the others.
I want to add one thing, that if compared to electrical networks, which are our country are connected with electric networks. So water networks are totally differently working. They are divided from city to city. And even each city are making its own water grid, which are using its own pressure and its own quantities. So it's almost impossible to connect even neighbor regions with water networks. And if to make such a big, huge project, it needs quite huge amount of money for project work, and then for have a possibility to connect all these regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodymyr. A question from Joseph Savage with the Surface Water Rule Administrator for the U.S. state of New Mexico. Centralized water systems seem particularly vulnerable to targeting during times of war. Would a shift towards decentralized electrical, drinking water, and wastewater operations be a step towards mitigating such risks? And I would pose that to all of you working in this space.
In such areas, it's possible to develop some decentralized possibilities and ability to the water, but mostly when we're talking about eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, these areas it's related to the regions that with a low quantity, low volume of water. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, that 80% of water sources related with the river, with surface. That is why it's not because we have the river, it's because there are no underground water, drinking water. So therefore, there is a huge main pipes in distance several hundred kilometers that going from the river to the cities. So if it will be possible to drill the wells to form some intakes underground, it will be done, but it's not possible because there are no drinking water underground.
Thank you, Dmitro. First to Frank and then over to Sebastian.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there, so for aside from the larger, the water canals, there are a number of decentralized water and wastewater systems, that in many of the oblasts or the regions of the country. So that does exist, but nevertheless, for the broader, urban areas, it tends to be very decentralized. And if you just even if you look at Donbassa, that was in the Donbass, that system as Sebastian described, it's, if I remember right, there's over 14,000 kilometers of water supply pipe in that one network. So that is definitely a centralized, putting all your eggs in one basket. So that's not what it's really we would like to, anybody would like to see going forward. There were a lot of reasons that it evolved that way. But either way, that said, even in the Donbass and other areas, there are still a number of smaller decentralized water systems that, provide for a few villages. Maybe no wastewater systems are there. It's, septic tanks that are desludged with, trucks. So there is a variety of there, but nevertheless, for the urban areas and some of the larger infrastructure, the kind of very large centralized networks predominate.
Thank you, Frank. Sebastian, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm on the same line as Frank did. I mean, it's very difficult to come to decentralized networks when we talk about large ones. And And that's why it's essential to understand the history behind this, on how and why the water networks were developed. I mean, we know that Donbass region, Donetsk coal basin, was the place of the development for the coal, for the steel production afterwards. And the multiplication of the mines and industries to transform this coal into coal and iron ore into steel made a lot of industries and population behind. So you have to feed in water all this population in a water scarce region, as Mitchell mentioned. So you cannot shift easily from one system to the other, even if small systems exist. You have, and that's the opportunity to these days to make, and that's my point, to make studies and see what could be the alternatives, because those huge systems were designed taking huge figures. They are oversized, and basically we can reduce the water demands by a factor of 10 or 20. So we can assess what are the alternative water sources nearby. So, but this would require huge time and not with a success at the end, unfortunately.
Sebastian, while I have you, I have a question for you from Michael Keyes, the diplomatic fellow from the Kennan Institute. Since 2014, how have UNICEF and other international organizations been working with the authorities in the eastern part of Ukraine? And he has authorities in air quotes, such as the Donetsk People's Republic, to resolve water issues for residents of those areas. Can you comment more specifically on, sort of going back to Erica's point about this is not a new issue, and so how have other international organizations been working in that region of the country?
The scope of work that we were able to do on the GCA, the government-controlled areas, Ukraine, mainland, was bigger than in NGCA, non-governmental controlled areas. But we were able to intervene on the two sides, to cross the line of contact, meet with the de facto authorities, and trying to negotiate our activities. I say trying because it's not easy at all. They are quite suspicious. They want to really keep the information for them. So having a full picture is almost impossible there. So, but we were able to really point the humanitarian needs and try to focus on them. So as such, we were able to transfer equipment to Voda Donbasu operating in occupied territories, and the same in Lugansk Oblast, dealing with the de facto authorities of Lugansk. And this until June last year. It was very complicated mechanism to be able to do that. And it was really humanitarian oriented on the occupied territories, while it was more large, as I said, on the Ukraine side. Emergency humanitarian recovery and development, really, on the Ukrainian mainland. But it was tough, I should admit.
Thank you, Sebastian. Erica, a question, sort of a combination of two questions for you from Johannes Van Dam from PATH and Wouter Beening from the president of the Institute for Environmental Security at The Hague. You mentioned the difficulty of holding Russia accountable because of their UN vote. Could you comment on what tools and mechanisms exist or should be developed to hold Russia and other actors accountable for deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure? Would Article 8.2b.4 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court regarding environmental damage be applicable in Ukraine? And I'm noting that you're not a lawyer and I don't want to put you on the spot, but you could comment on that.
Yeah. So this is tricky. I think, international lawyers would probably be better positioned to answer that, but increasingly, there are cases of holding, heads of state accountable for crimes against humanity, or or potentially, as mentioned with the International Criminal Court. Russia, it's hard to know whether any of those mechanisms will work. There may be an opportunity, to have, to create a tribunal, like an international tribunal specific to Ukraine. And that could be one mechanism. But, the problem is the current situation of what exists today will make it very difficult to go through the traditional UN system. So it's going to have to be something almost extraordinary, as having an international tribunal that works outside of the UN Security Council.
Thanks, Erica.
Yeah.
If anybody else wants to jump in on that, you're welcome to as well. I think, one of the first actions that Russian forces took when they invaded Ukraine was to blow up a dam on the North Crimean Canal. And one of the questions that came in is just, what is the current status of that canal? And this is so I wonder if somebody here would be comfortable addressing that question. we're not gonna make up an answer. So if nobody has the answer, we'll move on. Dimitro?
I'm not sure, but it's still working. It's still working towards Crimea.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, and there's also a question about whether there's concern of Russian attacks on dams across the country, such as the ones on the Dnipro River, and the flooding that could result in Kyiv and other cities, and what's being done to prepare for that scenario. Sebastian, is that something that you guys came across in your work? And Frank, next.
No, I think it would be the wrong decision to blow up the dams on the Dnieper River. I mean, it will obviously flood the cities downstream and so on, but it would just prevent for instance, the Crimean Canal to be supplied with water. The reservoir of Varovka was made for it. So blowing up would make an end of the water supply in Crimea. So I'm not sure that, and if the Russian troops and government want to use the different facilities, infrastructure afterwards, then they will not blow everything up. So, but everything can happen. We never know.
Yeah, Frank?
Yeah, I'll just add that kind of onto Sebastian there. I think that, the greater risk for these for dams is just the, collateral incidental damage that they are receiving. So for instance, the Kakhovka Dam north of Kherson, which, backs up the Kakhovka Reservoir, which actually provides water to the Zaporizhia, nuclear power plant. That the water levels in that dam in that reservoir have been going down a bit, and from a aside from the the water supply to the nuclear power plant, which is everything we've seen from the IAEA basically says that's stable, but the intakes for the people who live along the banks of the reservoir or the lake are their intakes have been lowered to the point where they're at risk of losing water supply to those communities. And all of this is as a result of that one of the gates in the Kakhovka Dam has been damaged. They tried to put some aggregate, some rocks, basically gravel in there to kind of reduce the level, reduce the leakage, but there has been leakage. that reduces the level of water in the reservoir, that, impacts the ability of those communities that live close by to collect water for their needs. So it just creates, it's kind of a little bit of a spiral there. And that to me is the bigger risk, those types of situations rather than intentional targeting. I think that's always there, but yeah, so I'll stop. Thanks.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Frank. Before I have I have two final questions. But before I go to those, I want to give Chris an opportunity to chime in.
No, just to thank you, Lauren, just to say thank you to Dimitrio and Vladimir. Thanks for joining us again this morning. We would love to continue this conversation, and I'd like to offer you what we can do from the U.S. Water Partnership to help you. And I'd like to continue our conversation. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we know how precious your time is and how important it is, the work that you're doing. So we really appreciate very deeply you taking the time to be with us today. Before we conclude, though, I have two questions. One is for anybody who wants to comment, and that's looking at the connections between how the impact on the water infrastructure has rippling effects on food security in the country and the country's economic security. So if you could touch on the food security and food systems and the agriculture point. And then I'm going to ask you all, next month the UN will host a high-level conference on water, and it's the first time they're doing this in 50 years. And I think today's discussion has underscored how important this sort of focus on water is. I'd love to get from each of you just like one or two of the points that you hope would be a focus of that discussion, or perhaps built into an agenda, a robust agenda on water that you would hope to see sort of highlighted at that UN conference next month. But first, can anybody comment on the impact of the war on water infrastructure, impact on food security and agriculture in the country?
I'll jump in broadly with food security because I think it's both internally and externally. It shows how integrated Ukraine is to the global community, like global supply chains, and that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had devastating effects for human security in Ukraine, limiting, access to water, but also decimating the agricultural economy, of which, large numbers of the population depend, but it's also affected large numbers of people in the Middle East who import grain from Ukraine. And, we haven't talked about other aspects of water, but there's been blockades of the major ports in the Black Sea. And so this is also another way of, targeting water infrastructure through the use of, blockades, not just trying to destroy a pipeline. And so, one has to look at this, look at food and food security within the global landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things also is that there were the immediate impacts, right? With the blockades, with the just being able to transport agricultural goods, but then also whether farmers were able to plant on time and to harvest, right? And so I think we're going to continue seeing these impacts as the war continues. Go ahead, Erica.
And contamination of the soil.
Yes.
I think that's something that, international development assistance and local officials are going to have to look at and test for is the contamination of the soil as they begin, the next planting season.
Dmitro and Volodymyr, do you have much interaction with colleagues who are focused in the agricultural sector?
Not exactly, but some of them, yes. It's mostly related with possibility to have a water, and That's it. In our region, we don't have a big difficulties with it. In our agriculture partners as well, it's okay. But in the southern regions, it's a biggest challenges. For example, in the Mykolaiv regions, I know very well that without water from Dnipro, all agriculture companies suffering very hard, heavily affected from it. They can't do their business at all because underground water is salted, and without river, the water from river, it's not possible to do the business.
Thank you, Dimitro. So for my final sort of wrap up question, I want to give you all an opportunity to highlight or put a spotlight on some key things that you would hope to see out of next month's UN Water Conference, whether it's a focus on a particular topic or a point on an agenda to make progress in a particular area related to water. And I am going to start with Sebastian.
Sure, we can. There was the water sector for the water or the international organization involved into the water sector. The main focus would be to reach the cap, to reach the SDGs by the end of the decade. We have many countries where we still have a lot of work to do on water, sanitation, and hygiene to make the life easier for everyone, especially for children. So there is a huge commitment to action from the different stakeholders, government, civil society, youth, international donors, or implementers to reach those targets by 2030. That's the main one. And this taking into consideration the rapid change of climate and the adaptation that we have to get on it. I mean, we can see the huge impacts in already water scarce regions like MENA, Middle East, and North Africa, or others. We will have massive migration of population due to the lack of water or the wrong urban management of the water resources or governance. So we'll have to, this may bring to further conflicts around water and sanitation. So we'll have to work on this and work on sustainable actions and try to scale up the implementations of those sustainable actions, and then try to work on the lesson learned, review what works, what does not, and what could be duplicated in some areas where operations worked by the past.
Thank you, Sebastian. Frank?
Thanks, Lauren. I'm, bringing it down just a little bit there. I think for me, how this could be, well, where it might be relevant, it would be interesting, first, the ability, if we look just in Ukraine from the emergency response side, how is there, or how can the conference promote advocacy to have windows of silence, to make critical repairs to systems, that especially in the Donbass and in eastern and southern Ukraine, because for instance, that, the Mykolaiv water intake, nobody was ever able to repair it as long as Kherson was, occupied. Now it's very, very aspirational, but, and I know Sebastian and knows this quite well, but there have been negotiations for windows of silence for years to make repairs to Donbassa, not always successful, but sometimes, yes. So I think that would be like, from an advocacy point, is like how, to promote and institute windows of silence for critical repairs that serve everybody. those water utilities. The second would be, in terms of access, if we look at the 17.7 million people who are in need in Ukraine, about 20% of them are in non-government controlled areas, in areas that Russia controls. So we really don't have access to them for, much really for water, sanitation, that hygiene. So I think that is a point that always needs to be raised. Who's serving those people and how are they being served? It's a challenge, very much an understatement. And the last point I would say is the recognition of people like Dmytro and Vladimir and the other, the Voda Canal operators and these the utility operators for these decentralized systems. These folks are heroes. And I mean, as are people that work in the health facilities and other utilities, but I'll admit that I'm biased, but I think that would be my third point, is to recognize that, the dedication and the work that and the challenges they've had to endure to keep these systems functional, given all the challenges that, we've talked about. So that's it. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
That's a really, really important point, Frank. Sort of remembering, while not everybody, but while a lot of people are in New York talking about water, remembering the people who are on the ground, making sure that those supplies remain intact. Erica?
So I guess I'll do one international, one local, more like Ukraine specific, but, globally, I think we need, we know the solutions. We know everything that needs to be done in the water sector. It often ends up being political, whether things are implemented or not, or we obtain our goals or not. And war is political. And I would like to see the international community really dig in and, reaffirm a commitment to protecting water infrastructure in war. Water needs to be protected. And water is a human right. And the Sustainable Development Goals is about ensuring access to water as a human right. And so the international community really needs to be very loud and clear that water infrastructure broadly cannot come under fire ever. I think what's going to be really important also is recognizing that different countries have, different understandings what's appropriate for their own water infrastructure and water supply systems. And this comes down to having more inclusive and participatory processes. And, from what I've been seeing, at least from reading, different news outlets and, social media, there's a lot of work already ongoing in Ukraine about rebuilding. And I would ask, that those that are providing assistance to let Ukraine lead on, how Ukraine would like its water system infrastructure to be designed moving forward and rebuilt, in a way that is going to help rebuild the economy, allow for people to return to their homes, to their livelihoods. And so that's, the two things that I would emphasize.
Thank you, Erica. Dmytro and Volodymyr. Maybe Dmytro first.
First of all, I want to say that for the next months, it's not related directly to the conference, UN conference, but I hope that we can find a solution how to win the war, defeat the aggressor on the battlefield, and to make liable for those what they made. Without it, we can do anything, and all our resources in our country is directed to the war. It's the first. Second, it's mostly related with the conference. I hope that we could be able to develop or create or develop some special program for Ukrainian water sector related with first for the surviving areas, second rebuilding, and third modernizing a new view of our all water sector. This is shortly.
Thank you, Dmytro. Volodymyr?
I want just to add, having this possibility to speak here, I want to say on behalf of all water sector of Ukraine, I want to say big thank you for all the organizations which are supporting us here. UNICEF, USAID, all other big and small organizations which are here with us, with our people, and supporting us. This is very important for us. Without this support, without this help, I think we couldn't step out of these big issues that we are dealing with. And it's also a big sign for not only for us, but also for our people, that we are not alone. We are not alone with this evil, with this enemy, that also civilized world is together with us. And I really hope that together with you, together with all of you, we can survive first, and then we can win, and third, we can become better and have a possibility to work in a western side of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Thank you all of you for your time today and for sharing your insights and your expertise. Dmytro and Volodymyr, we're very honored to hear from you and look forward to staying in touch and supporting your work in any way that we possibly can. Chris, thank you for the partnership on today's event. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Wilson Center, Abby Anderson, Claire Doyle, and Angus Soderberg for their support of today's event, as well as our AV team. The event will be recorded and available on our website on the page that you're on now as an archived video, and we'll have a summary written up on our blog, New Security Beat, as well. And please be in touch if there's any other ways that we can continue to support your work, Dmytro and Volodymyr. Thank you so much.